Hello, welcome again to this broadcast about building a Rails app from scratch. The Rails app we're building, if you're just catching up, is a Gumroad Wishlist. In the last episode, we talked about how to break down your initial idea into sequences of events that happen, or otherwise known as stories. You're telling the story that of your user walking through the job that your application is going to do for them, or at least help them to do. So that's where today's episode comes in. We're going to look at these events. We're going to look at the things that happen in the story of this Gumroad consumer doing the job of making wish lists of products from Gumroad. And we're going to take these events and group them together and decide what are the steps that they take that our app can help them with. Our app can either make them possible when they were impossible before, or make them a little bit easier or quicker to do, or more convenient. So let's take a look at this. One very easy thing we can do is look at the steps on their story and kind of weed out some things that we can't really do for them. Well, never say never, but let's just think at a more simplistic level of like a very basic Rails application, because that's the parameters that we've already got on this thing, and we're trying to start small. So maybe, technically, we could visit Gumroad and find products that they like for them if we had an artificial intelligence algorithm. That may not be completely out of the question for the future. But for right now, with an MVP mindset, let's figure out a way to mark these as things that are kind of outside the realm of our current app. So we're going to make those dark yellow. So these are the things that are kind of external but still relevant to the whole story taking place, the contextual story that our app joins in eventually. So here's where we can help. They see a product they like, and we want to bridge the gap from seeing a product that they like to eventually having added a product to the wish list. That's where we're going to zero in on for our first implementation when we get to actually building features for this app. So now we've got these two things separated out, and we've got two items that we know that we can build in a simple Rails application. I think that we've got enough here. We can skip straight to that and actually get to building a Rails app. So how do you decide where you're going to start when you build an application? This is a question that comes up every time. Every time we sit down, we have an idea, and we're like, okay, I'm ready to build this thing. But then you draw a blank. Well, that's part of what this system is supposed to help us with. So far in the video series, we've only been working on this app for maybe 20 or 30 minutes, but we already have a decent map of a lot of the core things that could end up being the entire MVP feature set for the app. Now, a lot of people might, what I've seen quite frequently, I'll put it this way, what I've seen quite a bit is that people look at the things that are standard in every app, and they build out this whole kind of container for all the interesting stuff. And then they reward themselves at the end by putting in the finishing flourishes that actually make it the unique app that it is. I don't know if it's just personality or that I'm impatient I actually have some rational reasoning for this, but I like to just jump straight to the interesting stuff. So, all joking aside, let me actually let you in on some of the reasons why. When you're creating a brand new app, the things that are in every app, like the authentication system, unless your app is all about the authentication system and revolutionizing it, and that is your main value proposition, that's going to be pretty standard. It's going to be the same as it is everywhere else. So in my opinion, instead of including it from the get-go and then having to worry about maintaining it the entire time that you're building the rest of your app, you should actually focus on the new stuff that your app is going to do. Because that new stuff has a lot of potential risk bound up in the uncertainty of how your new features, your novel stuff, is going to play out. Now, that said, most applications out there, or most of the features that we add to applications out there, are pretty simple. You've heard the term CRUD app. That stands for create, read, update, and delete. And those are the typical management activities that you have to do when you're managing your data within an application. And those are pretty well understood and well known. And most developers who've been around for a few years have built several of those kinds of features. And they all start to look pretty much the same. So all that said, if your application is only doing that and it's all just kind of boring stuff, for lack of a better way to put it, then maybe there's not so much of a reason to start one place over any other place. You just put your head down and you get the app done. If it really is that simple, you might be better off going for one of the Rails admin builder DSL libraries that actually give you a really simple shorthand to build out those CRUD applications very quickly and efficiently. And you don't have to think about design or how it's going to look. You just define what the things are, and it spits out a nice Rails GUI for those items. But we are building a pretty simple application here, but we're not building an overly simplistic one. There's some interesting things I'd like to look into with Gumroad in particular. I'd like to look into rendering the Gumroad cards in a nice format using their media tags. I'd like to also look into creative ways that we can integrate with Gumroad to make this as easy as possible, getting us from here to here. Ideally, one very simple way they could do it is, and this is probably the way we're going to implement it at first, is they see a product they like, they copy the URL, they go over to our app. If they don't have a wish list yet, they create it. Then they add the product to the wish list by pasting the link in and then submitting the form. Okay, that is very simple. But there are some interesting ways that we could look at integrating and making that a much more pleasant experience. I know for myself, if that was the process I had to do, that's not really much different from just opening the Notes app, and maybe it's even easier with the Notes app. So we want the Notes app to be far less an appealing a solution to this problem. So let's try to compete with that and smooth this path as much as possible. So, since this path is critical to the success of our application, that's where we're going to start. Not only is it critical, but it's also got a few unknown elements of risk. And so we need to get into those and dig into them as quickly as possible. And remember how I mentioned that you can end up with dragging some dead weight along? Well, if you build the simple stuff first, it might seem like a good place to start, because you think, oh yes, I understand how this works, I built it a million times, and you feel good, you get that dopamine rush. But particularly with an authentication scheme, once you build that out, then you have to deal with logging in and users and think about all those other things, because those tend to, the user aspect tends to kind of put tendrils out into the rest of the application logic. So if we start here instead with an MVP mindset, we can cut straight to the chase. We don't have to think about anything else. We don't have to think about users or any of the other junk that is kind of necessary in the applications, but is also secondary to the job. All we have to think about is getting this job done as smoothly as possible. And then once we have that dialed in, we can add in these other features that are not optional. They are critical features, but they're not the primary value proposition for the customer. So let's focus on dialing in that primary value proposition. In the next episode, I expect that we will actually get to writing code. So it's exciting times. Thanks for sticking with me through these kind of setup videos. I wanted to walk through this process because I know that starting can be such a daunting task for people who have never approached building a brand new Rails application. So I wanted to provide at least a little taste, a little sampling of some of the tools that are in my toolbox when I think about starting out a brand new Rails application. So hopefully now you're better equipped than you were before. And next up, we're going to be creating a new Rails app. See you next time.